Good afternoon. I'm Chinmay Ghevare, and I will be discussing the social, conceptual, and systemic influences in the development of the built environment of Jamshedpur. The study is based on the analysis of Aparajit Ramnath's paper titled Extra Imperial Influences in Indian Industrialization, the Technical Experts of the Tata Steel Works. Aparajit Ramnath, in his paper, studies Tisco's development and success in the interwar period from 1907 until World War II as a result of a series of extra imperial influences. His study brings forth various facets to extra imperial influences through his deliberate use of the term. He uses it to describe the inflow of people from foreign networks of American, European, and Asian countries and Indian provinces and princely states. It also includes modes of technological and knowledge transfer, funding networks, and institutional frameworks, all surpassing the purview of the British colonial government. Ramnath discusses the phases of the plant's development through specific recruitment practices. The first phase includes the employment of American and European experts in the plant's development and the circumstances during World War I, leading to the plant's expansion. A shift in focus of recruitment towards Indianization as a part of economizing production came next. The establishment of Jamshedpur Technical Institute, he asserts, to train potential Indian experts added a layer of extra imperial structure and efficiency to the company. He discusses two periods of JTI's development, 1921 to 1935, which was facilitated by provincial funding and popularity owing to oversubscription from various Indian provinces, and the other, post 1935, where the course was restructured based on meritocracy. Through his analysis, he attributes the company's success to systemic and efficient shifts in the recruitment policies. His chronological account indicates the emergence of and a constant shift in diverse social fabric in Jamshedpur. Hence, it is pertinent to note that the company's nature of employment and the developmental framework shaped Jamshedpur's demography as a whole. The context of these extra imperial networks proves to be an interesting precedent to study the influence of the emergence of this social fabric in the emergence of the city's spatial fabric. An understanding of the trajectories and the background of the systemic town planning and architectural interventions across the phases of Jamshedpur's development help analyze the reflection of the emerging social fabric described by Ramnath in the emerging spaces during the interwar period. Majority of built environment interventions by involved experts and the emerging physicality of the larger part over the phases of its development suggest Jamshedpur to have the character of a colonial city. The prevalent and effective practices within the colonial framework proved largely sufficient in planning. However, the nature of its inception and its diverse emerging demography suggest that its growth cannot be looked at from a singular lens of influences. It also suggests that the development of the city was a result of periodic systemic interventions which responded to the needs of the emerging and shifting social fabric and the existing nature of development. The company used spatial development through housing and institutions of utilitarian, educational, social, and cultural nature as welfare to incentivize employees and create an efficient structure of production and business. Based on the chronological exploration of the city's growth during this period, it is evident that architectural production in the city has operated in the more complicated, shared space of economic, cultural, and political influences. The catalogue thus derives from this analysis of the said emergence of spaces and series of evidences which elaborate on the premise of an interplay of social, conceptual, and systemic frameworks responsible for Jamshedpur's development. The experienced Pittsburgh firm of Julian Kennedy and Axel Salin, awarded the contract for the designing of the steel plant, built the original colony between 1909 to 12. It was focused on housing foreign managers and skilled workers. Forest lands encompassing 3,564 acres of land covering nearby villages were acquired to set up the plant and the township. The officers were initially provided with huts and gradually bungalows in the northern town. The other Indian clerical staff was housed in the southwestern parts, while the semi-skilled and unskilled workers engaged in constructions were left unprovided for and settled in the peripheral villages, which eventually became slums. The town's initial character resembled an American company town in gridiron pattern with essential amenities and few social spaces built in vicinity to the factory. Wide roads built with plantations around them became an integral part of the town from the beginning. Detached bungalows for foreign employees were provided with gardens and electricity to incentivize them for the foreign conditions they were living in. After the development began its operations in 1912, institutions with social and sporting relevance were initiated as a respite to the remote working and living conditions. Tata Institute or the United Club was the first such club built in 1913 in Northern Town. Being the only places of social interaction, clubs took the shape of prominent buildings in the city. Their architecture reflected this. Their spatial programs and activities were mostly influenced by Western cultures. Tata Institute catered to Americans and Europeans initially and was designed with its surface reflecting Indian and classical elements. Its articulation and inception in the early development suggest that its architectural influences were prevalent in the larger context of British colonial India, for the colonial government was in practice of building prominent structures with emphasis on their surfaces. Technologies like jack-arched roofing involved in its construction is also an example of the same. With no particular evidence of its makers, the influences in terms of demography and architecture appear to be intersecting, moving on from the initial planning seen in this phase. Initial development of educational institutions was influenced by American interventions in the plant and the city. The first school, Mrs. Perrin Memorial School, built in 1915, was meant as a memorial for American engineer Charles Perrin's wife, Keogh Monroe Perrin, and her work in the city. This initiated TISCO's formal interventions towards building educational institutions. The efficiency of the future labor force was perceived to be dependent on the educational facilities provided in town. The school was key in its development. Its double-story construction and emphasized front facade reflected the American influences it had, while the configuration and use of jack-arch technology for roofing corresponded to British architectural practices. The later development of schools was done with partial support from the colonial government apart from TISCO's funding, and the educational development came under the purview of a single organization for efficient management. Owing to this, the possibility of references to a standardized architectural language practiced by the British being adopted in schools cannot be denied. This would be a shift in influences based on the shift in demography and needs. The growth of the plant saw an inflow of social groups from various Indian provinces. This led to the establishment of provincial and cultural institutions like Maharashtra Hitkari Mandal, Madrasi Sammelani, etc. This growth was attributed to TISCO's establishment through pan-India investments and a rise in demand and production of steel during the First World War. Both attracted constructional and operational jobs. The formation of the said provincial institutions served as networks for potential employees and operated to support its beneficiaries. Maharashtra Hitkari Mandal, founded by early Maharashtrian employees, was one of the first such institutions. It was initially built to provide accommodation and food to employees. Its establishment in 1916 suggests that internal networks for and of the incoming social groups developed parallel to the larger scheme of developmental initiatives by TISCO. Its architecture was born out of necessities of social representation and reflected a standard configuration and surface articulation prevalent in colonial environment. It was devoid of any specific traits of Maharashtrian architecture, possibly due to limited funds and materials. Institutions like these can be observed as the first step towards formalizing the inflow of social groups. They can be effective in further establishing the need for formally housing the workforce. Until its expansion, TISCO's planning and architectural endeavors catered largely to its officers and experts. The company provided housing could only accommodate one-fourth of the population of the employees, which by 1919 had risen to 18,675. Hence, the migrated lower income groups sprawled along peripheries. By 1919, Ramdas Bhatta, Juksalai, Mohulbera, Sakshi, and others had turned into slums with rural core. The rise in population and bastis further led to sanitary concerns as well. In the midst of this, the company was Indianizing through JTI, and that accounted for a demand in the more structured township. Owing to this situation, 12,125 acres of land was acquired around the existing boundaries. Mr. F.C. Temple, the chief sanitary engineer to the government of Bihar and Orissa, was invited to undertake the further development. Temple's prior experience within the structure of the colonial government would establish a precedent for the employment of conceptual frameworks and practices tried and tested by the British. Prior to involving FC Temple, the company reviewed the possible approaches of developing the city. Memorandum submitted through Garden Cities and Town Planning Association in London showcased the need for expansion of housing, sanitation, roads, open spaces, markets, etc. Interestingly, Temple's proposal was similar to these suggestions. It included a hierarchical road network, extensive roadside plantation, and open green area development, and definite number and types of housing units planned as neighborhoods. The neighborhoods would have markets, schools, and clubs within reach. There was emphasis on creating village communities for low income groups as alternatives to bastis, with common modern amenities and sanitation. The neighborhood style of planning, according to Temple, would help to enrich people's lives amidst a major steel plant. This approach was a reflection of the garden city planning movement already established in the effective framework in England. Jamshedpur's comparatively nascent stage of development made the concept work. Established, effective, and transferable building practices within the colonial network hence proved useful and economical and supported TISCO's emphasis on economizing its resources and production during this phase. A standardized approach was observed in the majority architectural interventions proposed and implemented within this phase. These were primarily related to employee housing and reflected the colonial style of cantonment planning. Houses were utilitarian, with basic geometric shapes, linear planning, and a ubiquitous veranda facing an open garden. These were limited to a number per acre, depending upon the occupant's employment and marital status. There was emphasis on proper sanitation, drainage, and plantation. Locally sourced and manufactured materials, mainly brick and steel and lime, were used for construction with a gradual shift from sloped terracotta to flat roofs. The emerging spaces showed evidence of its roots in the practices evidently employed by the British PWD. A standardized way of organizing new developments was inherent in the British colonial domain. Coincidentally, Jamshedpur was being developed by a single entity, TISCO, similar to the PWD working under the British colonial government. It asserted a broader architectural affinity to the imperial network to carry out large-scale standardized interventions. Since this phase saw long and extensive development, popular and efficient methods of production proved beneficial to economize the expedited building production. Amidst the standardized architectural production influenced by colonial practices, a rather complex nature of influences and interventions were observed in buildings with certain value, especially in TISCO's General Office building. Built in 1926, it was a manifestation of the company's face value. A three-storied steel frame building planned around a courtyard, its surface was articulated by Indo-Saracenic elements. In a city that mostly comprised ground-level structure, this building was unique. The multiple floor rise with steel frame was a prevalent technology of the modern movement in the USA, an epitome of popular progressiveness then, while the articulation of surfaces with Indo-Saracenic elements was a British colonial intervention observed in the design of New Delhi and their way of legitimizing their relevance and power over India. This building in ways was TISCO's portrayal of progressiveness and an assumption of its expanse. An intersection of these technologies and stylistic influence across the imperial and extra-imperial network in the General Office building suggests that architectural production cannot be looked at from a singular lens of intention. Its development is lateral and operates in a complicated, shared cultural space with various socio-political influences. By 1935, TISCO had become the largest producer of steel in the British Empire. The periodic graduation of JTI experts and the plant's expansion saw the population quadruple with the demand for rapid restructuring of housing. Major P.G.W. Stokes, a military engineer who planned Quetta post the earthquake in 1935, was invited to plan the further development. Temple's proposals by then were marred by the Great Depression, rendering a number of lower income housing schemes either incomplete or scrapped. Formal stratified housing fell substantially short, and areas catering to lower income groups saw a haphazard development. Stokes Plan, submitted in 1938, initially intended to impose a spatial pattern drawn from city planning theories in the USA. He intended to develop the roadside settlements near villages to house low income groups closest to the factory and reduce their efforts of commuting. His plans reflected the concentric ring model of Ernest Burgess, who proposed that cities expanded outward from the central business district with working class housing nearest the core. But restructuring the large amount of existing development here could not be afforded. Eventually, Stokes' proposal resulted in the patchwork of housing clusters for low and middle income groups in the pockets of land around suburbs. This phase made it clear that the city could not develop as an individual entity, and its development was influenced by multiple factors which were highly governed by the socio political, economic influences, apart from the networks of conceptual and systemic influences. Stokes' plan was the last major intervention in the interwar period. The next, third phase occurred as the Second World War was underway. To structure the expansion of the city during this phase, Dr. Otto Königsberger, architect and town planner of the government of Mysore, was invited by the company in 1943. Despite being beyond the scope of the timeline coherent to Ramnath's argument, understanding phase 3 is key for the process of continuity which it is co-emphasized on is clearly reflected in Königsberger's proposal. This phase was a means to strengthen the structure of the city with a foresight. It catered to a population which by then had risen exponentially to almost 150,000. His plan was based on the garden city concept and neighborhood planning, an acknowledgement to the earlier temple plan. The haphazard development of the fringes and intermediate spaces did not reflect an idealized garden city despite plentiful greenery. Hence, he worked on providing optimal solutions to tackle it. He designated the town into industrial and residential zones and planned linear bands of built and unbuilt open spaces as parallel zones. Residential zones as neighborhoods were means to propose a framework on the existing fabric that resembled the British cantonments and further the stratification established in Temple's plan. In order to resolve congestion and haphazard housing, he proposed prefabrication of housing structures to facilitate mass housing and symbolized Jamshedpur's development as the steel city. This, however, was not materialized. Recognizing that massive urban restructuring was neither healthy nor feasible, his interventions eventually were an interplay of existing frameworks within the city and newer, contemporary concepts which ensured the city's response to the future inflow of people. Thank you.